Good morning, it's Friday the 17th of April. I'm Maret Gwyn and you're watching Europe Today, your morning fix of news and analysis live here from Brussels. Coming up today, France and the UK will later co-chair a meeting with allies on restoring navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. The critical waterway has remained effectively closed since the war on Iran began. We'll have the details. In other news this morning, a 10-day ceasefire in Israel's war on Hezbollah has come into effect overnight after what have been described as historic US-mediated talks between Lebanon and Israel. It comes as President Trump says he's very close to a deal with Iran. And an EU delegation is expected in Budapest later today for talks with the incoming Peter Magyar-led government. They're expected to discuss the release of EU funds for Hungary that were frozen under Orban. We'll bring you the details. And the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez hosts left-wing global leaders in Barcelona today for a summit of world progressives. We have an exclusive interview with the European Commission Vice President Teresa Ribera. But first, our top story this morning, a French and British-led coalition of around 40, mainly NATO countries, is meeting today and is expected to announce a solution aimed at securing the Strait of Hormuz. Military planners have been working on the plans for weeks. To explain more, our NATO correspondent, Shauna Murray, joins me here in the studio. Good to have you back, Shauna. Right. Tell us first, these talks happening today in Paris and online, what can we expect?
Well, the expectation is that this coalition will deliver a broad shape of an outline to reopen the Strait of Hormuz when the conflict ends. Now, they're saying that this is very much going to be a defensive operation. They will not be party to the conflict. But the idea is that they will send vessels, frigates, demining operations, personnel, radars, intelligence to the region to be ready to then kickstart the reopening of the strait when the hostilities come to a cease. Now, there's obviously huge risks in that because we don't know when this war is going to end. But the reason why this plan needs to happen today, or at least the outline needs to be in place, is because Donald Trump's been putting huge pressure on NATO allies, saying that they never came to his aid, and he's obviously threatened the alliance. And even this week, he went on US TV saying the Strait of Hormuz is already open, ships are coming back and forth, we're doing it, which is not really the case. But anyway, he says our country should not be paying trillions of dollars to NATO, once again threatening the future of the alliance. So this is a very important day.
And Shauna, we also saw reports overnight that the US has told its European allies to expect delays in the delivery of weapons that were previously approved by the US. Tell us more.
This is something that allies have feared since the very beginning of this war, and the fact that this war is now dragging out. NATO allies have purchased equipment such as interceptors and so on from the United States to be used in Ukraine through the prioritised Ukraine requirements list at NATO. Now they're hearing that that equipment won't get to Ukraine, so that's hugely problematic for Europe's defence, for the NATO defence, and of course for the Ukrainians. And it was something that actually has been expected. But we know that Ursula von der Leyen had a meeting with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, this week, as well as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, Alexis Grinkovich. And they relayed this to her and said that Europe needs to once again step up its defence industrial base even more than before. And I spoke to a NATO source last night who said to me, look, there's only so much equipment to go around. That's why the defence industrial base is so important. So this is a very tricky situation now for Europe, not just from an economic perspective, but now for the defence of the continent. Right?
Indeed, Shauna, thank you so much for that very comprehensive update. We'll keep an eye on your reporting, of course, throughout the day. Now, the UN Development Programme says ongoing military escalation in the Middle East could push 30 million people into poverty worldwide. Our reporter, Lauren Walker, spoke to the agency's administrator, Alexander De Croo, who, of course, was formerly the Prime Minister of Belgium. She started by asking him about the global spillover effects of the conflict.
The impact goes way beyond the region. For example, sub-Saharan Africa is severely impacted by what is going on in the region. Small island states, for example, in the Pacific, you start to have a few islands that just don't have enough fuel anymore. So the impact of the war and the blockade that is linked to it has a deep impact, and it shows that war is development in reverse. It takes decades to lift people out of poverty. It takes 6 weeks of war to push them back into poverty.
Are you confident that a diplomatic solution can be found between the US and Iran?
Am I confident? I have no crystal ball. Am I hopeful? Yes. And that, of course, is the first measure, is to stop the war, or at least come to some type of normalization of the shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz. But even if the war would stop today, you will need economic interventions to avoid that whole countries and whole populations are being pushed back in poverty in a structural way. Yeah, it's macroeconomic interventions that international financial institutions can do on, for example, providing targeted and time-limited cash outs to populations who are impacted, or providing free access to fuel, cooking gas, and so on. If you don't do these targeted, timely macroeconomic interventions, you will have many more ripple effects. And we have not talked about the ripple effects of poverty, of food insecurity. That could lead to additional conflicts, that could lead to more displacement and migration flows, that could lead to other types of extremism.
And you're obviously part of the UN, an institution which has been heavily criticized recently. The US, by the US president, for example, there are fears that his board of peace could replace it. What does the UN bring to the table in this geopolitical context that we're facing now?
We have multiple UN organizations that, despite the criticism, and I'm not deaf for the criticism, are very, very much appreciated by the populations with whom we work. Now, the key element for us is to have access. For example, in Gaza, which is a really desolate place these days. More than 85% of people have lost their homes and are living in the middle of the rubble in tents that not even worth the name of being a tent. We can help many more people. We can provide way more assistance, but we're not getting the access. My attitude would be, game on, let us show what we're capable of, but then also give us the room to do so. For the moment, there's no access for UN organizations, but no one else is doing it. I'm open to work together with the Board of Peace. I think the Board of Peace is based on a Security Council resolution. It has helped in bringing a ceasefire or the diminishment of fire in Gaza. These are good things. I mean, these are realizations of the U.S. administration. But now we need to move into the next phase, and moving into that next phase really is urgent in helping people to reconstruct their lives.
Lauren Walker speaking to Alexander De Croo there. Moving on now, because an EU delegation is expected in Budapest later today to meet with the team of the incoming Prime Minister Peter Magyar. For more, we can cross over now to Budapest and bring in our correspondent Sultan Shiboshegi, who is standing by for us there. Good morning, Sultan. Great to have you on the show. Can you first run us through what we're expecting from these technical talks between Brussels and Magyar's team today?
Good morning, Europe Today. Thank you for having me. Yeah, today, finally, it's going to happen, because originally this delegation was planned for yesterday, but they postponed it. It's going to be a really important one, because Peter Magyar's key campaign pledge was to restore Hungary's ties with the EU and unblock billions in funding that had been withheld over rule of law and corruption concerns. The recovery funds question is particularly urgent. Hungary stands to lose nearly 10 billion euros if payments are not disbursed before the end of August. On Monday, Magyar outlined a four-step plan to meet the conditions for accessing the funds, including joining the European Public Prosecutor's Office, restoring judicial independence and safeguarding economic freedom. Peter Magyar has already spoken twice with the European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen, who pledged her support. But this is not just the only item what will appear on Friday's agenda. Hungary is currently withholding the EU's 90 billion euros aid package to Ukraine after the leaving PM Viktor Orban blocked the previously agreed decision at the March EU summit. For sure, the delegation will try to convince Peter Magyar, even though we had an opt-out.
OK, Sultan, thank you so much for that update, and we'll keep an eye, of course, on those talks happening in Budapest today. Moving on now to Barcelona, where the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez is hosting a raft of left-wing world leaders, including the presidents of Brazil, Colombia and South Africa. Our EU editor, Maria Tadeo, is there for us and just before the show sent us this update.
Well, good morning indeed, Marit. We are in Barcelona, where the Spanish government is hosting a convention today and tomorrow, bringing together heads of states, intellectuals and activists of what it calls as the progressive social democratic world. In a way, you could argue this is the opposite, the complete opposite of the CPAC convention led in multiple occasions by President Trump. And of course, it's not a secret that the Spanish Prime Minister and President Trump have clashed on pretty much every subject, including the war in Iran, which this country, Spain, says is completely illegal and will set the region on fire. Now, in terms of today, I spoke with Teresa Ribera. She is the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, also a former minister in the Spanish government. And I began by asking her in our interview, why is it that the world needs progressive ideas, but also has the European left lost the working class because of a disconnect between their vision and their needs? Let's take a look.
My conviction is that we need to think on how to solve the problems. So it is not against anyone, but to be fair and solid on the type of responses that we are proposing and that we are playing and walking the path. So I could not say. Obviously, there is a political view that is pretty different from those political views being supported by the most conservative voices. But the main intention is to say what we want that probably provides a different view of the things that others do want.
But since you talk about the idea of progressive Europe, some would say the left has lost the European working class because it doesn't have the right priorities, because it has put forward an energy. I wonder, is this also a moment where the left needs to do a form of soul-searching too?
On the contrary, I have the impression that climate action is providing opportunities to people that could feel the harm, the penalties of not taking climate action. Energy transition means counting on sources of energy that do not create additional problems and that allow people to have lower bills. So it is part of the discussion that has been distorted in purpose to prevent action in those fields that could help people to do things and to count on the high quality of life.
Over the weekend, there was a very important election in Hungary in which the Hungarians voted for change. Prime Minister Viktor Orban will be leaving office after 16 years. He was obviously a big ally of President Trump in Europe. I wonder, what does that election, that result, that call for change say to you when it comes to Europe at this stage?
We've seen that Hungarians did decide that they wanted to be Europeans, that they wanted to fight for their rights, that they thought that this was important in terms of democracy, and they decided to vote massively. Massively. It was not a tight election. It was very clear, the result. So I think that it shows to what extent this narrative against Europe, against working together, against being united, against the defense of the civil rights and the integration is not something that can win in the middle long run. On the contrary, it probably exposes the limitations and the harm that people could feel in the absence of this joint forces, joint effort of the European nations to develop the European program.
Just a final point on this. There's been reports now that the Commission, and obviously this now touches the core of your portfolio, this is a massive job that you have when it comes to the competition laws in the EU. And these reports suggest that there is now a plan to massively dilute some of the regulation to allow for mergers to create major European champions. Is that the case? Are you preparing for this?
We are entering into the last phase to adopt an updated version of our merger guidelines. So we have already a very sound draft. After having heard everybody, we know that we need to update our reality to today's economy. But that doesn't mean forgetting the core bulk of our mission, which is protecting consumers from abuses of dominance. So this means that we may take into consideration innovation, long-term sustainability, resilience. This means that we need to be ready to understand the global context and the impact in the national and the domestic economy. But this doesn't mean forgetting about the importance of keeping the level playing field.
So you're not, just as a final question on this, because it's important, so you're not preparing major deregulation to allow companies to come together? That is not in the pipeline?
No, of course not.
And I say this because you have said in the past that too much simplification at times has made things confusing. So your fundamentals is still to say deregulation would be bad for the EU?
This is not a product to deregulate. This is a product to modernize and to be transparent of the criteria that we will be using to assess when a merger is pro-competitive and provides positive effects to the economy, and when it is a real risk and it is not proven that the operation does not comply with what it is being said, either if it is innovation or sustainability. So I think that it allows much more innovation and much more security for all, but at the very same time, it is quite clear that we will remain defending the interests of the consumers and not accepting whatever as a blank check.
That was Maria Tadeo speaking to the European Commission Vice President Teresa Ribera. Now, there's another major election coming up in Europe this weekend. On Sunday, Bulgarians will head to the polls once again after a series of elections that have failed to break a persisting political deadlock. Our Jakub Yanis explains what's at stake.
Bulgaria heads to the polls this Sunday for its 8th parliamentary election in 5 years. The country is the poorest in the European Union and the electorate is exhausted by a prolonged political crisis. And on paper, Bulgaria is a recent European success story, having finally adopted the euro on the 1st of January and joined Schengen. But there is a big euro hangover. On the ground, citizens feel impoverished and ignored by the political class. So who is stepping in to fill the void? This profound frustration has set the stage for a bitter showdown between two major figures. One side is Borko Borisov. He's the veteran centre-right leader of the GERB party. While firmly pro-European, his decade in power was plagued by scandals, making him the symbol of the entrenched establishment. Facing him is Rumen Radev, the left-leaning former president, who sensationally resigned in January to run for prime minister. And Radev is riding a wave of populist anger, campaigning to dismantle the oligarchy. But his vocal opposition to military aid for Ukraine and softer stance on Moscow have left Western allies alarmed. And although polls show Radev leading Borisov 31 to 21%, neither is close to a majority, leaving the winner to inevitably cobble together a complicated coalition. And the battle for control is fierce. Just weeks before the vote, authorities detained over 200 people for electoral coercion. And the tactics are shocking. Some local officials tricked individuals into believing their state-funded winter heating and hot lunches were personal gifts from politicians. So Sunday is about much more than electing a government. It will determine whether the country can finally address these deep structural problems and rebuild public trust in the political system.
Jakub Yanis there, and of course we'll bring you the analysis on the outcome of those elections on our show on Monday. But that's it for us for today and for this week. Thank you so much for your company. Remember, if you have story ideas, tips or questions for us, you can get in touch by emailing us at europetoday@euronews.com. We love to hear from you. You can also stay up to date on our reporting on Euronews and euronews.com. We'll see you on Monday. In the meantime, have a great weekend.